Tonight, someone you know is going to die. Not tonight, maybe, not soon, hopefully, but one day, someone close to you will stop breathing, and you will have to decide what to do next. You will plan a funeral. You will choose flowers. You will stand in front of other people and try to find words. And you will do all of this because your culture told you to. But here is the part nobody tells you. The rituals you follow are not modern inventions. They are not the product of religion or civilization or even language. The real answer to what humans do when someone dies goes back further than you can imagine, and it is far stranger than you have ever been told. Let's go back, way back. Not to ancient Egypt, not to the Greeks, not even to the first cities. We need to go back roughly 300,000 years to a time before Homo sapiens had fully arrived on the scene, when the world was shared by multiple kinds of human. Your ancestors were alive, but they were not alone. And in a cave in South Africa called Rising Star, something happened that would shake the entire field of paleoanthropology to its core. In 2013, a team led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger discovered the remains of at least 15 individuals deep inside a cave system. The species was named Homo naledi, small-brained, ancient, a creature we once assumed was too primitive to think abstractly. But the bones were arranged, deliberately placed. There were no signs of carnivores dragging the bodies in, no evidence of flooding carrying them. The only explanation that fits the evidence is that Homo naledi was intentionally bringing its dead to this location. A creature with a brain a third the size of yours was burying its dead, or at least ritually depositing them, possibly 100,000 years before your species even existed. Think about what that means for a moment. The impulse to do something with a body, to not just leave it, is not uniquely human. It may be one of the oldest things about us. But what did your direct ancestors do? What did Homo sapiens, fresh out of Africa, actually practice when death visited the group? The oldest known intentional burial of a Homo sapiens dates to approximately 78,000 years ago at a site called Pangaya Saidi on the coast of Kenya. Researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published their findings in 2021. What they found was a child, roughly 2 to 3 years old, carefully placed in a pit, its body flexed, its head resting on a pillow, almost certainly made of vegetation. The burial was deliberate. Someone took time. Someone cared. And that act of care, that deliberate positioning of a small body in the earth, means that grief, as a behavior, has a paper trail going back nearly 80,000 years. Now here is where things get genuinely strange. When researchers look at these ancient burials, they notice something that repeats across cultures, across continents, across tens of thousands of years of human history. The body is almost never left flat. It is almost always curled, flexed, knees drawn up toward the chest, arms tucked close. Position after position, grave after grave, from Kenya to Iraq to Europe to Asia, the body is placed like a sleeping child, or like a figure waiting to be born. Anthropologists have debated this for decades. Some say it was practical, that a flexed position required a smaller hole. But others, including archaeologist Paul Pettit, who has spent his career studying Paleolithic mortuary behavior, argue the flexed position is not accidental. It is intentional. And it suggests that your ancestors may have conceptualized death not as an ending, but as a transformation, a return, a kind of rebirth. They were not just disposing of a body. They were staging one. And the staging did not stop at position. The things people placed in graves tell you something profound about what they believed. At a site in Sungheir, Russia, dating back roughly 34,000 years, researchers found a man buried with more than 3,000 mammoth ivory beads. The beads were arranged on his body in patterns that suggest they were sewn onto clothing before burial. Making those beads, by hand, one by one, would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours of labor. Next to him, 2 children were buried head to head, each covered in thousands more beads, wearing carved ivory jewelry accompanied by spears made from straightened mammoth tusks. Someone spent years preparing the items these children were buried with. Years, for people who were already dead. Your ancestors were not just burying the dead. They were sending them somewhere. But here is the counterintuitive part. Not every ancient culture buried. Some burned. Some exposed the body to the elements and waited for birds or insects to clean the bones. Some kept the bones close, passing them between families, rubbing them with ochre, the same red pigment used on cave walls. Archaeological evidence from sites across the world shows that red ochre, that vivid iron oxide pigment, appears again and again in ancient mortuary contexts. At a site in Kafse Cave in Israel, bodies dating back more than 90,000 years were found covered in ochre. The pigment is protective in some technical sense, but that does not explain the care with which it was applied. Researchers like Francesco De Rico, who studies the symbolic behavior of early humans, argue that ochre in burial contexts points to something we are deeply reluctant to accept. Your ancestors were not just burying the dead, they were decorating them. They were making them beautiful for wherever they were going. Now shift forward in time. Not 90,000 years, maybe 10,000. And something happens to human death rituals that we almost never talk about. Farming changes death. Before agriculture, when humans lived in small mobile bands, the dead were buried near where they fell, in caves, under rocks, in riverbeds. The group moved on. Grief was real, but the relationship with a body was brief. Then agriculture arrives. Humans stop moving. They plant themselves in the earth, literally. They begin to accumulate property, territory, lineage, and suddenly, the dead become important in a new way. They are not just ancestors. They are proof. Proof that your family has been on this land for generations. Proof that you belong here. At Neolithic sites across Europe, archaeologists have found long barrows and megalithic tombs where the same bones were moved, rearranged, and reused over centuries. The dead were not forgotten. They were actively managed. In a site called Atalhike in what is now Turkey, dating roughly 9,000 years back, people buried their dead directly beneath the floors of their homes. You slept above your ancestors. You cooked above your ancestors. You raised your children above your ancestors. The line between the living and the dead was not a wall. It was a floor. Think about your own home. Think about what is below it. The archaeologist Ian Queet, who has studied Neolithic mortuary practices extensively, suggests that this kind of ancestor curation, the deliberate keeping and tending of the dead, served a social function. It bound communities together. It created shared memory. It gave a group a story that stretched back beyond any living member. The rituals around death were never just about the dead. They were always about the living. They were about making the living feel that they belonged to something larger than a single lifetime. And that function, that precise social mechanism, is still operating inside every funeral you have ever attended. When you stand in a room full of people who knew someone you loved, and the air is thick, and nobody knows what to say, and someone tells a story about the person who died that makes everyone laugh despite everything, you are doing something 80,000 years old. You are binding the group. You are building shared memory. You are doing exactly what the people at Sunghir were doing when they spent 10,000 hours making beads for a man who could no longer wear them. But there is one more piece. One final layer that most people never reach. The neuroscientist and anthropologist Dean Falk has studied the evolution of the human brain and its relationship to social bonding. One of her arguments is that the capacity for grief, the specific, devastating neurological experience of losing someone irreplaceable, is not a bug in your design. It is a feature. It exists because your ancestors lived in small, interdependent groups where losing a single member was genuinely dangerous. The grief response evolved to force you to process the loss, to restructure your social map, to figure out who you are now that this person is gone. And the rituals, the burial, the ceremony, the flowers, the words spoken over a coffin, exist to give that restructuring a shape, a container, a beginning and an end. Without ritual, grief has no edges. Your ancestors knew this, not in words, not in theories, but in their bones. Literally, they carved it into the earth beneath their homes. They painted it in red on the bodies of the people they loved. They bent a child's knees toward its chest and laid its head on a pillow of grass and covered it in the ground and walked away and kept living. Because that is what you do. Because that is what you have always done. Tonight, when you think of someone you have lost, you are not alone in that feeling. You are standing in a line that stretches back 80,000 years, filled with people who did the same thing you are doing right now, who looked at an absence and refused to let it mean nothing. That refusal, that insistence that this person mattered, that their body deserves care, that their memory deserves tending, is the oldest thing about you. Not your language, not your tools, not your cities. This, the way you grieve, the way you say goodbye. That is where your humanity begins.